Welcome to Resilient. My name is Mike Kearney, the Deloitte Risk and Financial Advisory CMO. A little over 5 years ago, I started this podcast with a single mission to talk to leaders about how they encountered and emerged even stronger from risk, crisis, and disruption. And looking back, I couldn't have imagined where we would end up. I am so grateful for the time that all of our guests have given to us. If you're listening for the first time, check out past episodes. There is gold in hearing from other leaders about their experiences, insight, and advice. Today is no different. I'm joined by a strategist who is exploring a topic we often talk about, resilience. But what's different, you might ask? In this episode of Resilient, Bill Marquard, Managing Director, Deloitte Monitor, talks about new insights into how resilient leaders connect disparate dots, marrying art, science, and systems thinking to cultivate greater resilience for their organizations and even their teams. Because this is a topic that has so many different dimensions, I've invited him to do a few episodes on his own. So let's hear what Bill has to say. Hey, Bill, welcome to Resilient.
Mike, thank you. It's great to be here with you.
Hey, Bill, I'm going to ask about who you are and get your background, but I really want to start with the fact that you attribute studying philosophy, I think in college, as a critical element on your journey in business and strategy. Can you start? Why is that?
Sure. Well, I became a philosophy major as a freshman, and I had certainly no aspirations at the time of becoming a philosophy professor or anything like that. But what I didn't realize was how well philosophy was training my mind for business strategy. I mean, if you think about philosophy, it's about making logical connections, seeing patterns that others don't. You know, the ability to maybe articulate an argument from a start to a logical conclusion. Those were all skills and disciplines that I learned in philosophy that I found to be incredibly valuable as a strategy consultant, and also as a strategy executive with corporation as well.
Do you have any examples that you could share?
When you think about data and analytics today as an example, we've got such amazing tools between artificial intelligence, cognitive tools, et cetera, to look at vast amounts of data. But just making decisions based upon the data alone and not introducing the human context can end up getting off track. We're working with one retailer right now trying to better understand how the assortment mix should change in the store. And we've got some very sophisticated AI systems that we're using. But what philosophy has been able to do is to help understand the logical progression. What's the role of a national brand in this category? What's the role of certain products? Why are customers shopping the way that they are? And it's that ability to really dissect those connections via philosophy that helps make the conclusions and the recommendations even richer.
And that goes back to the second question I was going to ask you, is this passion for connecting the dots in unexpected ways. How does connecting dots help leaders navigate the unknown or even become more resilient?
Throughout my career, I've always been passionate about metaphors. And Roger Van Oak, who is an expert at creativity, once said that metaphors connect two different universes through some similarity. And in doing so, metaphors help us to understand one idea by means of another. So, this use of metaphors, this idea of looking outside of the core purview of business, is a way that we as leaders can make the unknown known. Every situation that we face, we haven't necessarily been there before, but if there's an analog, if there's something that we can refer to that has common characteristics, we can often learn very effectively from that. And also what it does is enables us in our minds to basically frame a situation that's too large in a way that's actually manageable and that we can lead and manage through it.
Are there any metaphors that you've seen over the last year or leaders that have been able to communicate during a time of extreme volatility, uncertainty that has helped them and maybe even put their employees or their customers at ease, with this crazy world that we've been in over the last 18 months?
Natural systems metaphors I find to be very, very rich. So for example, if you look at the rainforest, It has 3 different levels. Each level of the rainforest communicates with the other levels. If one level, like the canopy, starts to deteriorate, the ground and the mid-level end up compensating, et cetera. And it's an amazing example of what it takes, or the value that occurs when the entire system, when the whole system comes together in order to solve a problem or address an issue. And you look at what resilient leaders have faced over the course of the last couple of years with the pandemic. And what you see is that it wasn't just the leadership team, but it was the leadership team and all of their employees that ended up having to rally and work together in order to find the workarounds, to discover different ways of doing things. That whole system included vendors who were willing to do unusual things or create new supply chains that they hadn't created before, that were able to help all of us to navigate through the pandemic and to maintain the economy, at least at the level that it's at now. It certainly obviously could be better, but nonetheless, I think the economy has sustained better than many of us would have anticipated at the outset of COVID.
Hey, Bill, you talk about the fact that metaphors and connecting the dots comes really easy to you. I don't know if that's the case for everybody. So if you were counseling a leader in connecting the dots, sharing metaphors, telling stories, what would you tell them?
All of us have interests and passions that are outside of business. And that's the first place that I think we can all look. I mean, as we try to frame the situations that we face in front of us, look to the things that we're passionate about. One of my areas of passion is actually Leonardo da Vinci, and studying him and trying to understand a little bit about the way he thinks. Leonardo is a great example of how you bring art and science together in order to make decisions. And sometimes when I'm working with retailers, if you think about merchandising, what items you select, where you put them on the store shelves, how you market them, that's a great example of how you bring art and science together in order to make key business decisions. So I tend to tap into Leonardo, my 500-year-old mentor, to provide some of that advice. But all of us as leaders, we all have passions. Think about the frequency with which we use sports analogies through business, or analogies of trips and traveling that we've taken. I know a number of my friends and the executives that I work with love to travel. Well, these last 18 months to 2 years of COVID have been a journey for all of us. What are the characteristics and the similarities between the journey that we've taken over the course of the pandemic relative to the experiences that we have when we're traveling on our own for pleasure?
It's interesting that you talk about kind of looking outside of your world, because that is an area that I've been very interested in. And we had a Cirque du Soleil clown on the Resilient podcast, and what we were doing is trying to understand how the world of the circus can translate into corporate America and how you manage risk. And I actually probably learned more about managing risk and thinking about it differently by hearing a Cirque du Soleil clown that was also an acrobat talk about how he managed those type of risks. So I love what you had to say. I want to spend a minute talking about you, especially because you're going to be hosting a series of conversations on resilient leadership. Where did you get your start? Maybe some formative, defining experiences?
Sure, Mike. Well, you mentioned at the outset of the show about my background as a philosophy major, and I came home at the end of my freshman year and I told my parents I was going to be a philosophy major. And my dad, a lifelong truck salesman, didn't quite understand that, or it was outside of his realm of experience. And he walked over to the kitchen counter, he picked up the yellow pages, put them in front of me, and said, "If you find philosophy listed in there, I'll pay for the rest of your education." And it was Dad's way of saying, whatever you do, what's the marketability? Where is the opportunity in the marketplace? What's the talent and skill that you're going to bring? And so therefore, I actually started my career and spent 17 years at one of the major professional services and consulting firms, not Deloitte, but another firm, where I started out in audit. I also did a lot of financial advisory services and corporate restructuring. And it was the corporate restructuring work where I really developed and honed the skill set around strategy.
So I want to go back to the conversation with your dad. What did you tell him after you went through the phone book?
Well, first of all, I did not find philosophy listed in there, but I also assured him that one of the reasons that I wanted to study philosophy is at the time I was good or experienced at math, but I wanted to take philosophy in order to train the parts of my brain that weren't as well developed. The reading comprehension, the logical thought, the decision making. So I tried to explain that this was a matter of rounding out the person and preparing for business, as opposed to becoming a philosophy professor, for example. But one of the seminal moments for me as an undergraduate at Notre Dame was getting into my first accounting class as a junior. And although it was very difficult to get into the business school, I was nonetheless able to take that first accounting class. And that's really where my passion for business and for accounting as the language of business really developed.
So what have you been up to for the last couple of years? And I know that you've got a lot of interest in resilient leadership. Talk about what you've been doing.
Well, when we were at the very outset of the COVID crisis and the pandemic in late February of 2020, the firm asked me to really step in and help to program manage our global response to our clients related to COVID. And that really gave me a really unique perspective, Mike, not just on the business elements related to COVID, but especially the personal elements. And what we found, and this whole idea of resilient leadership has really emerged as a result of how we were trying to work with and walk alongside CEOs and other senior executives as they tried to navigate their own organizations through the COVID crisis. And as we got into it, what we recognized is that resilience isn't a destination. Resilience is really a way of being, and that resilient leaders are first defined by who they are, not by what they do. The empathy and passion that they have for their teams, their willingness and their bias to put the mission first. How do you stabilize the organization to meet the crisis at hand? But also, how do you embrace the long view? Many, especially CEOs, are very adept at looking out on the horizon. They see at the horizon, over the horizon, at what the future holds, and they're able to cast a vision for a future that is positive, that is flourishing, and therefore their people can't wait to walk alongside them and walk behind them on that journey to that future. This pace of change and this upheaval is definitely here to stay, and I think we need to recognize that although the cycle might look different, as leaders, we're going to be faced with these same upheavals and disruptions and discontinuities going forward. We coined the term at the outset of COVID that organizations went through 3 phases: respond, recover, and thrive. And, that they first were just responding to the crisis and triaging. Then they were beginning to plan for how we recover and get back to a new equilibrium or a different normal. But then ultimately, how do we ultimately look out on the horizon and emerge much better and much stronger than we were before? Rather than just casting aside the respond, recover, thrive language as the pandemic has waned a bit, what we realized is that a resilient organization is the one that's able to cycle through, respond, recover, and thrive for any crisis or for any opportunity. And therefore, resiliency was not, just about the ability to get back to status quo, but instead, a resilient organization is one that's able to cycle through, respond, recover, thrive for anything it's facing.
That's fascinating. So, Bill, you're going to be conducting, I think, 4 interviews on resilient leadership on this channel. What are you planning to cover, and what drew you to these new topics that you're going to be focusing on?
Traditionally, a visionary leader is one who anticipates and guides the organization to a bold future. But what we found is that resilient leaders also embrace a second form of vision, that they're able to connect seemingly disparate dots that other leaders don't see across disciplines, across sectors, and across geographies. we refer to it as having developed 2020 vision because of the year that we just went through. But the series is really going to focus on some unique takes on business, or some unique ways that we can look at business issues to learn from metaphors. For example, there's an individual named Will Houston. He's a magician, but he is also a lecturer at Imperial College London in the medical school, because what the medical school has found is that there's so many parallels between the interaction that a doctor and patient have and the interactions that a magician and the audience have. If you think about the patient views the doctor as being the expert, there are unknowns in the relationship and they don't necessarily know where things are going. The doctor has to be able to do an examination to understand what's happening with the patient, but at the same time maintain a banter and a dialogue which is both informative to the doctor but informative to the patient as well. And those are some examples of things that are some characteristics. You wouldn't normally think that medicine could learn a lot from magic, but nonetheless, when you start to bring those two together, it makes a very significant difference.
Sounds good. I want to spend a few minutes just talking about resilience. What are you hearing from leaders today about their biggest challenges in remaining resilient during the pandemic?
I think the biggest challenge is sustaining the energy level of their employees and their teams going forward. This has occurred and gone on for a lot longer than any leaders or their teams anticipated. And therefore, there's a bit of fatigue that is set in with all the time that we spend in front of screens trying to stay stoic. We don't get the chance to get up and walk in between meetings. But there's a fatigue related to what's going on with our families and children in school, or children having to homeschool in a virtual environment, et cetera. There are just a lot of these dynamics that have never really been introduced before and have lasted for a lot longer. We also, to borrow some of the terminology and the learnings from psychology, we're all experiencing ambiguous loss, and ambiguous loss is a loss that is that you don't quite understand, that you can't control, and there's really potentially no end to it. And the term of ambiguous loss was originally applied in psychology to situations where perhaps somebody is lost at sea, or a loved one is suffering from dementia. But what we're finding is that all of our people are suffering some level of ambiguous loss related to the pandemic. It's out of our control. We don't necessarily understand it, and we wonder if there's an end in sight. We thought that end was in sight several months ago, and now you look at the variants like Delta and Mu, and you realize that we might be in this cycle for a while. So being able to hold the space for our people as they navigate and walk through this time of ambiguous loss is a real challenge for leaders around the world.
So Bill, one of the things that you've talked about is this notion of ambiguous loss. Have you seen any leaders that have been able to articulate this in a way that really connects with their employees and maybe gives them a path forward, a way that they can deal with this in an effective way?
The executives and leaders that I've seen to be most effective are the ones that call it and name it for what it is. And they're also transparent about what they know and what they don't know. As tragic as the pandemic has been, one of the potential positives is that we as a society and we as business colleagues are doing life together. We're meeting each other's spouses and pets and children, and we see each other in our natural habitats. The senior leader, maybe whose children are grown and out of the house, who can nonetheless relate to their employees who are in two-worker families that have 3 children at home under 6 and are balancing just a ton of pressure and a ton of priorities at the same time that they're trying to keep the business running.
It's interesting because I've seen some leaders that have done a really good job talking about the impact that COVID has had on them personally and even professionally. And it goes back to the point that you were making earlier that a lot of times leaders were not taking care of themselves. I've seen some do a really good job, and I think that does make them feel kind of more human, more relatable, and like, hey, we're going through this together. So that notion of vulnerability as a leader, and also that you don't have all the answers, I think really resonates with me.
As I've worked with leaders over the years, and actually as part of the training that we do at Deloitte for some of our managers, we focused on a handful of characteristics that define a leader. They are curious, vulnerable, and servant-hearted. And it all starts with self-awareness. And therefore, it's that vulnerability. Relationships are built in vulnerability. And that admitting that we don't necessarily have the answers to everything, or admitting that we're trying to decide between several courses of action. You're absolutely right. It's the more that a leader is vulnerable with the team and is able to share that humanity, the more successful that they are and the better that they're able to relate to their people.
Yeah, and the one thing that I've seen is certain leaders do an incredible job because it's authentic. There's some that I've seen that, it almost feels a little forced. So I think the whole notion of vulnerability is critical, but I think it needs to be in line with their personality and kind of what people would think and expect. Because I've seen it also go kind of sideways where, maybe somebody was coached to be vulnerable, but it didn't feel authentic.
And as you were saying that was, the two words that came to mind were authentic and genuine.
Yeah.
So, agreed.
But one of the things you talk about in your series of papers is that resilient leadership requires greater followership, which requires greater trust, which I totally agree with. But I'm curious, when you think of trust, do you have a way that you define it? Because sometimes trust can feel somewhat esoteric. It's kind of like you know it when you see it, but it's hard to get your arms around.
Yeah, we wrestled with that exact question because you're right. Trust can seem ethereal. It's who doesn't agree with trust is important.
Right.
What we've realized and what we've written about and we've worked with our clients is this idea that trust is really the currency of resilient leadership. Trust is an exchange of value. Trust by itself doesn't have any intrinsic value. Think about a $20 bill sitting on the corner of a desk. It doesn't have any intrinsic value on its own, but in an exchange, it has a significant amount of value. It buys a gift for somebody. It buys dinner. It is a donation for somebody in need. So it's in the exchange that the value occurs. The same thing occurs with trust. A retail client, for example, that has a money-back guarantee on some of their private branded products in the store. That's an investment that they're making in the customer relationship in the hope that the customer will try the product and ultimately trust the quality of that product. And if you think about it, as that relationship expands, as the customer shops more frequently at the store, the customer's trust increases, and likewise, the investment that the retailer needs to make in giving money back actually decreases because the customer trusts more and more. So when you think about trust as a very tangible form of exchange and relationship, that's where it really comes alive. What are the specific acts and steps that the corporation is taking in order to build trust with the customer? Or what are the steps that leadership is taking? What are the investments that they're making in that relationship in order to engender and earn the trust of their employees, of their teams?
And how do you connect that back to resilience? Are you saying that if you have more trust of your stakeholders, your employees, your suppliers, that it allows you to be more resilient? Can you just maybe fill in that gap?
Sure. Well, we talked about resilience as being the ability to cycle rapidly through, respond, recover, and thrive for a crisis or an opportunity. If you think about it specifically in a crisis and what's occurred during the pandemic, think about the trust fractures that occurred with some governments and with some healthcare organizations and with NGOs, with the media, et cetera. Those are all places where trust fractured, and that trust needed to be built in such a way for people to be able to respond with the kinds of behaviors that would lead to health. or that would respond. For example, something as simple as a restaurant. Think about how trust is built when the restaurant communicates what it's doing to promote hygiene, when you see hand sanitizer when you walk in the door, when all the staff are masked, etc. It's a way of communicating to the patron that we're taking certain actions in order to protect you. Therefore, I, as a restaurant patron, are building trust in that relationship.
Yeah, in some respects, I think back to the civil unrest of last year. And I think what I found was there was a lot more eyes on leadership and how they were going to respond. And so it's those actions in that moment that could build trust or take it away. And so I could see your point. It's not necessarily doubling down, but it's being kind of hyper vigilant, that you're focusing on doing the right thing, because that's when you can really develop trust with your employees or other stakeholders. So that makes a lot of sense.
And that also derives another important point about trust, which is that trust is an appreciating asset. In other words, if you invest in it over time, it continues to build and grow. But trust can also be depreciating, and it only takes one action. It only takes one misstep for the value of that trust to drop precipitously. And therefore, that's one of the reasons it's so important to protect trust as an exchange of value, and to make sure that you're continuing to build it and for it to appreciate for the organization.
Bill, in your series, you also talked about courageous conversations being at the heart of decisive, bold leadership actions, which I totally agree with. But what are some elements, in your opinion, of what a courageous conversation looks like?
Well, we talked a little bit before about the importance of vulnerability and transparency. A courageous conversation includes naming what everybody else sees, and rather than putting it under the carpet, putting it directly on the table. I know you're all concerned for what the status of the company or the status of your jobs is going to be. And think about this in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. Let's call it and name it. When you do need to take dramatic actions in order to preserve cash or to reduce costs, it's a matter of being straightforward. Address it head on. Don't be truthful about it, and be as open and honest as possible, because it's that courage and that transparency that comes with it that is not only a key component of trust, but it also ends up further reinforcing the relationship between company and customer, between leader and employee, between organization and alliance partner.
Awesome. Hey, Bill, I have a few final questions, and we'll go through these quickly. And the first one, and you've talked a lot about this, but I'd like to kind of put a bow on it. And that is, what are the attributes in your mind of a resilient leader, based on everything you've seen, everything you've written about, and even some things that you're thinking about in the future?
This really gets back to what are the key characteristics of leadership. And there's 4 characteristics of leadership: self-awareness, curiosity, vulnerability, and servant-heartedness. It all starts with self-awareness. It starts with the leader's ability to understand who they are, to understand what their strengths are, and also understand and see the places where they're potentially at a disadvantage, or their weaknesses that they need to develop. It's being curious to find ways to improve. It's being vulnerable with your people and your teams, and always keeping the other in mind first and foremost. How do I serve this customer? How do I serve my team? How do I serve my alliance partners? So it all ties back. For a resilient leader, it's those 4 characteristics and the ability to continue to cycle and grow that really makes the difference.
Is there one thing that you would suggest that leaders should be focusing on today? Like, if you were to wrap this all up, like, here is the most important concept, here's the one thing from a resilient leadership perspective, what would that be?
A resilient leader is one who works herself or himself out of a job. Meaning that if we're focused on how do we make the people around us successful, how do we make our teams successful, etc., it not only builds them up, it enables them to grow, it enables them to develop. But as they take over more and more of our responsibilities, it frees us up for the next thing. It frees us up to do something, bigger and better going forward. So it seems a little bit paradoxical, but a leader's primary responsibility is to work herself or himself out of a job for that very reason.
Final question. So, Bill, one of the things that we've been doing over the last year and a half, as we've done, 30 or 40 of these conversations, is to ask the leader, what gives you hope for the future? Based on everything that you've learned. So how would you answer that? What gives you hope for the future, Bill?
The resiliency of the human spirit. We've talked about resiliency a lot from a corporate perspective. We've talked about the resiliency of leadership and what it takes to be a resilient leader. But at the very heart, when you look at individuals and the undying hope that comes from the human spirit, that's what gives me the greatest confidence going forward, that there's a fire and a light inside all of us that helps us to continue to lean forward and to move forward toward better, toward flourishing, toward the flourishing of the other, and toward the flourishing of ourselves. So it's that undying fire in the human spirit and the desire to be who we were made to be that I think really gives me the greatest hope.
I love that, Bill. And in many respects, I think hard things are a prerequisite for success in life. And what I mean by that is I think resilience is the way in which we overcome challenges in our life. But I also believe that if we aren't challenged every year, quite frankly, obviously in different ways, we're not going to achieve what we can personally, organizationally, or even on a societal level. So completely agree with that.
Iron is hardened in the midst of the fire.
Yeah.
We're all formed in this cauldron. And if we're willing to be malleable, to be like, sealing wax that is malleable enough to be stamped and grown to that next level, that's where change occurs. If we're hard and brittle, we end up cracking.
Awesome. Bill, thank you very much for this conversation. And quite frankly, I'm really looking forward to your series and hearing all the great concepts, guests, and discussions that you're going to have on resilience leadership. Bill, thank you very much for such an interesting conversation. You've given me, quite frankly, a lot to think about in building resilience. Your study of resilient leaders and how they connect seemingly disparate dots that others don't see across disciplines, sectors, and geographies is fascinating. I'm especially looking forward to your upcoming interviews with real-world resilient leaders who are able to capture new, unexpected, and emerging opportunities amid crisis. We've covered a lot on today's episode. If you want to know more about the Connecting for Resilience series and many perspectives across leadership, visit us on Deloitte.com and search Connecting for Resilience. And before I sign off, I have two questions. First, tell me what you thought. And second, what can we bring to you next? Feedback is so unbelievably important. We'd love to hear from you about topics and leaders of interest. Hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter to share your ideas. And for more insights from many iconic and resilient leaders, just go to Deloitte.com/resilient. Until next time, stay safe and remain resilient.